Ma'am, this area is for debrief personnel only. We can handle the room from here. The voice belonged to Sergeant Kade, and it was pitched in that specific frequency of practiced professional condescension. It wasn't mean, not exactly. It was the tone a man in his mid-20s, carved from granite and confidence, used for people he had already categorized and dismissed. In this case, the category was harmless civilian admin. The woman he addressed didn't look up from the neat stack of folders she was placing on the corner of the long, polished conference table. She was older, maybe 60, with graying hair pulled back in a simple, functional knot. Her clothes were nondescript, sensible shoes, plain slacks, and a navy blue polo shirt that had seen better days. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her hands placing each folder so its edge was perfectly aligned with the one beneath it. She was just part of the room's furniture, another fixture of the support structure that made a base like Camp Lejeune function. The 4 other Marines of Recon Team Echo, slouched in their chairs around the table, paid her no mind. They were exhausted, wired, and still vibrating with the after-echo of a kinetic 3-month deployment. They smelled of stale sweat, jet fuel, and the coppery tang of adrenaline that hadn't quite washed out. They needed this debrief done so they could get to the real business of beer and sleep. The woman, Evelyn, finished with the folders and moved to a cart laden with pitchers of ice water and glasses. She began to set a glass and a small notepad at each of the 12 places around the table. Her movements were economical, almost unnaturally so. There were no wasted steps, no fumbled gestures. Each glass was placed with a soft, definitive click, exactly 4 inches from the table's edge. Sergeant Kade watched her for a moment, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He had just returned from a place where a single misplaced footstep could end you, and he had little patience for civilians who didn't follow clear, simple instructions. He ran a hand over his high and tight haircut. "Ma'am," he repeated, a harder edge to his voice this time, "thank you for the water. The room is now restricted. You need to leave." This time she looked at him. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, but they held his gaze without wavering. They weren't confrontational, just observant. It was a look that took in his posture, the tension in his shoulders, the slight wear on the strap of his kit lying by his chair. It was a look that processed information far faster than he was comfortable with. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Of course, Sergeant. Just ensuring everything is prepared for Captain Rostova." The mention of their company commander's name gave the Marines pause. It suggested she wasn't just a random volunteer from the USO. Still, Kade wasn't about to cede control of his team's space. "The captain knows we're here. We're fine. Please, clear the room." He made a small shooing motion with his hand, a gesture of finality. Evelyn didn't react to the dismissive gesture. She simply picked up her empty tray, her back ramrod straight, and walked toward the door. Her gait was what a casual observer might call a little stiff, the way older people sometimes walked. But it wasn't the stiffness of arthritis or age. It was the rigid economy of a body trained for decades to minimize its silhouette, to move with purpose and control. It was a posture of discipline, not infirmity. As she reached the door, it swung open, and Captain Eva Rostova entered. The captain was a force of nature, a woman whose command presence filled a room before she'd even spoken a word. She was sharp, intelligent, and carried the immense respect of every Marine under her command. She gave a curt nod to her team. "Echo, settle in. Let's get this started." Then she noticed Evelyn. "Oh, Evelyn, thank you for setting up. I appreciate it." Evelyn gave another one of her small, quiet smiles. "Not a problem, Captain. Let me know if you need anything else." She slipped out of the room, closing the heavy door behind her with a soft click, leaving the 5 Marines and their commander alone. Kade smirked slightly. So she knew the captain. Big deal. She was still just the help. The debrief began. Captain Rostova stood at the head of the table, her expression all business. "All right, Kade, talk to me. The objective was surveillance on the mountain pass. The report says you broke observation and engaged. I need to know why." Kade leaned forward, the swagger draining away to be replaced by the focused intensity of a professional warrior recounting a mission. "Ma'am, the intel was flawed. The target wasn't a logistics convoy. It was a high-value individual, surrounded by a heavily armed escort. They weren't transiting. They were setting up a command post. We observed them deploying sophisticated comms gear, stuff we weren't briefed on. He tapped a finger on the table. We had a window. We took it. Another Marine, Corporal Jensen, the team's tech specialist, chimed in. The problem, Captain, is the proof. My primary optics were damaged during the exfil. The only clear footage we got of the HVI and their equipment is on Specialist Greer's helmet cam, and the file's corrupted. Rostova's eyes narrowed. Corrupted how? Jensen sighed, running a frustrated hand through his hair. It's a fragmentation error. The feed cut out and restarted during a firefight, and the final write sequence was interrupted. The file is there, but it's unreadable. I've tried the standard recovery protocols. Nothing. The IT guys at the main hub said it's a lost cause without sending the drive to a forensics lab in Quantico. That'll take weeks. The frustration in the room was palpable. Without that video, their justification for breaking the rules of engagement was just their word. It was the difference between a commendation and a formal reprimand. Captain Rostova stared at the large monitor on the wall, which currently displayed a pixelated mess of green and gray static with an error message in the corner. Weeks is not an option. The brass wants answers by tomorrow. She paced behind the table, her boots silent on the linoleum floor. The air was thick with the sour taste of failure, not of the mission, but of the bureaucracy that followed. They had done the hard part, the dangerous part. Now they were being hamstrung by a technical glitch. The door opened quietly again. It was Evelyn, carrying a fresh pot of coffee. Kade shot her an irritated look. "Ma'am, I thought I told you this room was..." He trailed off as Captain Rostova held up a hand, silencing him without looking. Evelyn seemed not to notice the tension. She simply placed the coffee pot on the sideboard. But she didn't leave. Instead, her gaze lingered on the corrupted image on the screen. She tilted her head, her pale blue eyes analytical. For a long moment, she just stood there, observing. The Marines exchanged bewildered glances. What did this old admin lady think she was going to do? Offer them a cookie? Kade was about to speak again when Evelyn's quiet voice cut through the silence. What codec was the camera using? The question was so unexpected, so specific, that it stunned the room. Corporal Jensen, the tech specialist, blinked. It's a proprietary H.265 variant, military grade, encrypted stream. Evelyn nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on the screen. She took a half step closer to the console connected to the monitor. Did you try to force a header rebuild from the raw data stream instead of using the wrapper? Jensen stared at her blankly. A what? The recovery software doesn't have that option. It's all automated. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Not pity, but a kind of patient understanding, the way a master craftsman might look at an apprentice fumbling with a basic tool. The automated suites are for civilians. They're designed to be safe, not effective. They won't bypass handshake failures on encrypted files. She looked at Captain Rostova. Captain, may I? Rostova, looking intrigued and slightly bemused, gave a short nod. Be my guest, Evelyn. Kade started to rise from his chair. Captain, with all due respect, that's a classified terminal. She doesn't have clearance, but he stopped as Evelyn moved past him. She pulled a rolling chair up to the console, her movements fluid and sure. Her hands hovered over the keyboard for a second, and then they began to move. It wasn't typing, it was a blur. Her fingers flew across the keys, not with the frantic pecking of an amateur, but with the ingrained muscle memory precision of someone who had spent thousands of hours speaking a machine's native language. She didn't use the mouse. She navigated entirely through command line prompts, bringing up a black screen with glowing green text that none of the young Marines had ever seen before. It looked ancient, something out of a Cold War movie. Sergeant Kade and his team watched, their mouths slightly agape. This was not the fumbling of a well-meaning but clueless civilian. This was the work of a high-level expert. The lines of code scrolled past faster than they could read. Evelyn's face was a mask of concentration, her pale eyes reflecting the green glow of the terminal. She was no longer the quiet, unassuming woman who brought them water. She was something else entirely, something focused and formidable. After about 2 minutes of this silent, furious activity, she stopped. She hit the enter key one last time with a definitive tap. On the main screen, the pixelated static flickered. It resolved into a series of jagged lines, then froze. Jensen let out a disappointed sigh. "See? It's fried." But Evelyn didn't move. "Wait," she said, her voice calm and low. A progress bar, stark and simple, appeared at the bottom of the screen with the words, "Rebuilding file index from data fragments." It slowly began to fill. The Marines were silent, their earlier arrogance completely evaporated and replaced by a growing sense of awe and confusion. Who was this woman? Where did a civilian admin learn to do this? They looked at their captain, but Rostova's face was unreadable. Her eyes locked on Evelyn with an expression of intense curiosity. The bar reached 100%. The screen went black for a second, and then, with perfect clarity, the video feed burst to life. The footage was chaotic, visceral. The sound of gunfire, shouting in a foreign language, the heavy panting of the Marine wearing the camera. But it was stable, and it was damningly clear. The camera panned across a rocky outcrop, and for a solid 10 seconds, it focused on the face of a man they recognized from intelligence briefings, a notorious bomb maker, a man supposedly 200 miles away from that location. He was surrounded by men setting up a sophisticated satellite dish, the kind used for coordinating large-scale attacks. The video was the smoking gun. It was everything they needed and more. A collective sigh of relief went through the Marines. Kade looked from the screen to the quiet woman sitting at the console. She was already wiping the keyboard and mouse with a sanitizing wipe from her pocket, her task complete. She had just saved their careers, possibly even the lives of others, by salvaging the data that proved a major threat was in their area of operations. She had done it in 3 minutes, with no fuss after their own specialist and an entire IT department had given up. The room was silent for a long moment, the only sound the audio from the helmet cam. Finally, Kade found his voice. It was quiet, humbled. "Ma'am, how did you do that?" Evelyn finished wiping the console and stood up, pushing the chair neatly back under the desk. She looked at him, and for the first time, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. "Old systems have old back doors. You just have to know where the keys are hidden." She turned to leave, her work seemingly done. It was then that Captain Rostova moved. She hadn't been looking at the screen for the last minute. Her eyes had been fixed on Evelyn, specifically on a small point of metal on the collar of Evelyn's faded navy blue polo shirt. It was a pin, no bigger than a thumbnail. To the young Marines, it would have looked like nothing, a piece of cheap tarnished costume jewelry. It was shaped vaguely like a bird, but its features were worn smooth from decades of wear, the original bronze or brass peeking through the flaking silver plate. It was indistinct, forgettable. But Captain Rostova was a student of history, not just the official histories, but the whispered, classified ones. The ones you heard about in hushed tones at the War College, stories of units that existed in the shadows and were later denied. Her gaze locked onto the pin. Her sharp, commanding features seemed to slacken, her face draining of color until it was the color of chalk. The shape of the bird, the specific stylized design of the swept-back wings, and the sharp, downward-angled head. It wasn't just any bird. It was a phantom peregrine, an emblem she had seen only once before, in a heavily redacted digital archive file on a program from the late 1970s and early 80s. A program designated Project Nightfall. It was a deep reconnaissance and direct action unit that operated completely outside the normal chain of command. They were the ghosts who tested the bleeding edge of technology and tactics. They were the first women integrated into direct combat roles years before it was officially sanctioned, their existence a closely guarded secret. The unit was officially disbanded in 1985 after a mission in Central America went sideways. Most of its members were listed as killed in action or simply vanished from the records. They were called the Phantoms. Rostova's breath hitched. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. The Marines, sensing the seismic shift in their commander, turned from the screen to look at her. They saw her face, pale and awestruck, and followed her gaze to the unassuming woman by the door. Sergeant Kade frowned, confused. It was just an old pin. What was the big deal? Captain Rostova's posture, already military straight, somehow became even more rigid. It was the posture of a junior officer in the presence of a living legend. She took a single, deliberate step forward, her eyes never leaving Evelyn. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper, tight with a level of reverence the Marines had never heard from her. "Ma'am," the word was different this time. It wasn't a polite address, it was a title. Evelyn paused at the door, her hand on the handle, and looked back. She saw the recognition in the captain's eyes. A flicker of something ancient and weary passed through her own gaze, a silent acknowledgement. Rostova swallowed hard, her composure, for the first time in their memory, completely shattered. "My apologies, ma'am," she said, her voice cracking slightly, "for my team's lack of professional courtesy." She didn't salute. A salute would have been wrong, a breach of protocol and a spectacle. Instead, she did something far more profound. She brought her heels together with a soft, barely audible click and gave a short, sharp nod, dipping her chin no more than an inch. It wasn't a greeting. It was an act of deference, a gesture of deep institutional respect from one warrior to another, acknowledging a history and a sacrifice that her young Marines couldn't possibly comprehend. The Marines stared, utterly bewildered. They had seen their captain dress down a full-bird colonel. They had seen her remain ice-cold under enemy fire. They had never, ever seen her look at anyone with such profound, undisguised awe. The gesture, so small and yet so monumental, hung in the air. Evelyn's tired face softened. She gave the captain a slow, understanding nod in return. "They're a good team, Captain. They're sharp. They just need to learn that the most valuable intel doesn't always come through a scope." She looked past Rostova to Sergeant Kade, whose face was a mask of dawning comprehension and shame. "You have good instincts, Sergeant. You saw a threat to your team's security. You just misidentified the target." Her words weren't a rebuke. They were a lesson, delivered with quiet grace. With that, she turned and slipped out of the room, the door closing with the same soft finality as before. For a full minute, nobody moved. The helmet cam footage continued to play on the screen, a silent testament to their mission, but all eyes were on the closed door. Finally, Sergeant Kade broke the silence, his voice hoarse. "Captain, who in the hell was that?" Captain Rostova took a long, shuddering breath, her composure slowly returning, though her face remained pale. She walked to the head of the table and stared at the empty space where Evelyn had stood. "That, Sergeant," she said, her voice low and filled with a somber weight, "was a ghost. A ghost who walked out of a history book that you don't have the clearance to read." She looked at each of her Marines, her gaze hard and piercing. "That was a phantom, and you told her to get the coffee." The weight of her words settled over them, heavy and suffocating. A phantom. They didn't know the specifics, but the tone in their captain's voice told them everything. They had been in the presence of royalty from a secret, forgotten kingdom of warriors, and they had treated her like a janitor. Kade sank back into his chair, the image of his own dismissive hand-wave flashing in his mind. He felt a hot, crawling shame that was more intense than any physical wound he'd ever sustained. He looked at the perfectly aligned folders, the neatly placed glasses of water, the recovered video feed playing on the screen. It was all part of the same thing, a quiet, unassuming professionalism that was so profound they had been completely blind to it. It was the competence of someone who had operated at a level they could barely imagine, now applied to the simple task of making a room ready for others. Captain Rostova let the silence stretch, letting the lesson sink deep into their bones. Finally, she straightened up, her command presence reasserting itself like a physical force. "The report will reflect that the data was recovered by a technical consultant from a legacy systems department. Her name will not be mentioned. Her presence in this room will not be recorded. Do you understand me?" A chorus of "Yes, ma'am," answered her, the voices subdued, respectful. "Good," Rostova said. "Now, let's review this footage. Let's do our job with a fraction of the dignity she just showed you. And let's pray we earn the right to be in the same service as people like her." As the debrief continued, Kade couldn't focus. He kept seeing that quiet, older woman, her economical movements, her analytical eyes, and the ghost of a smile as she taught him a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. The most dangerous people weren't always the ones holding the guns. Sometimes they were the ones who quietly made sure the room was ready for the fight, and sometimes they wore faded emblems of birds that only a few had the eyes to see.